On an autumn afternoon, the slanted sunlight streaming through the library windows warmly illuminated the old literature books piled on Alison McGregor's desk. It had been 10 years since she began working as a librarian at this small suburban library. The patrons loved her gentle smile and courteous service, but lately Alison felt as though a heavy stone had settled in the depths of her heart. At 6 in the evening, after finishing her work at the library, Alison drove home as usual. The White House at 12 Maple Street was the home she and her husband Chris had chosen together with dreams of their early marriage. The garden had a small rose bush that should have bloomed beautifully in spring, but this year she had neglected its care, and only withered branches were noticeable. When she opened the front door, she heard the sound of the refrigerator door closing from the kitchen. Chris McGregor was a serious man who worked at a local accounting firm. Now in their 10th year of marriage, their relationship had lost its former passion, and they exchanged only daily greetings. "Welcome home," Alison greeted him cheerfully. "Yeah," Chris answered without turning around. He had a beer can in his hand and was staring at his smartphone screen. "I'm working late again tonight. I'll be home late." "Again?" "That's the third time this week." "I'm busy." "It's tax season," Chris replied in an irritated tone. "You wouldn't understand, but that's what having a responsible job is like." Alison nodded without saying anything. Until 5 years ago, they had been undergoing fertility treatments. Test results showed that natural pregnancy was impossible due to bilateral fallopian tube blockage, and several attempts at in vitro fertilization had failed. The treatment costs strained their household budget, and the emotional burden was enormous. Eventually, they decided together to give up treatment. Since then, it felt as though an invisible wall had formed between the couple. On Saturday weekend, Alison went shopping at the supermarket alone. Chris had left early in the morning saying he needed to organize work documents and told her he wouldn't be back until evening. Alison had begun to notice that his overtime and weekend work had increased abnormally lately, but she didn't have the courage to confront him about it. While selecting vegetables at the supermarket, she suddenly felt mild nausea. "I must be a bit tired," she thought as she headed to the checkout. That night, lying in bed, she felt a slight tightness in her abdomen. It was similar to premenstrual symptoms, but only 2 weeks had passed since her last period. On Monday afternoon, her mother-in-law Margaret visited without warning. She made it a habit to visit twice a month and consistently made snide remarks to Alison about wanting to see a grandchild's face. However, Margaret seemed different today. Instead of her usual stern expression, she appeared to be suppressing a knowing smile. "Alison, you look well lately," Margaret said while drinking tea. "Has something changed?" "Nothing in particular," Alison answered noncommittally. "Really? I can tell, you know." "Women's bodily changes," Margaret's eyes glinted meaningfully. "Perhaps there's some happy news." Alison was puzzled. Indeed, she had been feeling unwell for several days, with persistent mild nausea. However, the doctor had definitively stated that natural pregnancy was impossible. Still, when she looked in the mirror, she couldn't shake the feeling that her abdomen seemed slightly swollen. "It's just your imagination, Margaret," Alison smiled vaguely. After her mother-in-law left, Alison stood in front of the bathroom mirror. From the side, her abdominal contour did indeed look different from before. Impossible, she thought, yet she felt a small hope sprouting in her heart. At the same time, however, an inexplicable anxiety was also growing. That night, Chris didn't come home until after 1 in the morning. Alison pretended to sleep while listening to her husband's footsteps. His showers took abnormally long, and he never let go of his smartphone. Something had changed. And something was definitely happening to her own body. Alison fell asleep in the darkness with her hand on her abdomen.
Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what I did with Reddit Stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious.
2 weeks later in the morning, Alison stared at herself in front of the bathroom sink. There was no longer any doubt. Her abdomen was clearly swollen, and the waist of her usual skirts had become tight. The nausea continued, especially severe in the morning hours. However, remembering the diagnosis from 5 years ago only deepened her confusion. On her way to work at the library, Allison stopped in front of a store that sold maternity clothes. In the shop window, a pregnant mannequin with a large belly smiled happily. Could I become like that? She wondered, even as the doctor's diagnosis report flashed through her mind. Bilateral fallopian tube blockage makes natural pregnancy impossible. She still remembered those words clearly. When she arrived at the library, her colleague Dorothy Williams greeted her with a warm smile. She was Allison's only close friend at work and an experienced mother who had raised 3 children. "Allison, you look good this morning," Dorothy called from behind the counter. "Did something special happen?" "Actually," Allison lowered her voice. "I've been having some changes in how I feel." Dorothy's eyes lit up. "Could it be?" "I don't know. But my stomach." "Congratulations." Dorothy clapped her hands quietly. "Finally, God has given you a gift." "What does Chris say?" Allison showed a troubled expression. "It's not confirmed yet, so I haven't said anything." In reality, she was afraid to talk to Chris. Considering his recent cold attitude, she didn't know how he would react to this news. Moreover, she was confused by the reality that something medically impossible seemed to be happening. During lunch break, Allison was reading books about pregnancy in the library's medical section. The symptoms of early pregnancy matched exactly what she was experiencing. Morning sickness, abdominal tightness, breast tenderness, and obvious weight gain. However, medical books about fallopian tube blockage clearly stated that natural pregnancy is medically impossible. In the afternoon, a regular patron, Mrs. Johnson, smiled when she saw Allison's abdomen. "Congratulations, Allison. When are you due?" "Excuse me. You're pregnant, aren't you?" "Your belly." Allison hurriedly covered her stomach with her hands. "No, that's... You don't need to be modest. I've had 4 children myself, so I can tell. That kind of swelling is definitely pregnancy." That evening, Allison walked home with heavy steps. It was no longer possible to hide her pregnancy. The changes in her body were becoming more noticeable daily, and people around her were beginning to notice. However, her fear of telling her husband and her confusion about the medical contradiction tormented her. While preparing dinner, Chris came home. He had returned earlier than usual, but his expression was dark and he wouldn't let go of his smartphone. "Welcome home," Allison turned around. Chris looked at her and stopped moving for a moment. "You've gained weight." Allison's heart leaped. "Chris, look at my stomach. I don't think this is normal weight gain." Chris spread out his newspaper while answering. "It's probably stress eating. You haven't been exercising lately either." "But I'm also having symptoms like morning sickness." "You're overthinking it." Chris's voice was cold. "You've always been too neurotic." Allison was at a loss for words. Her husband's indifference pierced her heart. The old Chris would have suggested going to the hospital together if there was even the slightest possibility of pregnancy. The next Saturday, Margaret visited again. This time, she was even more cheerful than usual. "Allison, you really do look well," Margaret said as she sat on the living room sofa. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," Allison answered noncommittally. "I can tell, you know." Margaret's eyes glinted meaningfully. "The special changes that happen to a woman's body." "What do you mean, Margaret? Are you still going to hide it?" Margaret beamed. "Finally, I can become a grandmother. It was worth the long wait." Allison was confused. "But the doctor told me." "Doctors can be wrong too. Look at reality. Just look at your belly and it's obvious." Margaret stood up and took Allison's hand. "What does Chris say?" He must be delighted. Actually, nothing's been confirmed yet. You don't need to be modest. This is the best news for the family. After Margaret left, Allison sat alone in the living room. Her mother-in-law's confident attitude only added to her confusion. Why was she so certain? That night, Allison pulled out her diagnosis from 5 years ago. From the thick file, she found the paper with the doctor's words written on it. The doctor's signature was still clearly visible. However, her reflection in the mirror was unmistakably that of a pregnant woman. Her abdominal swelling grew larger week by week, and morning sickness symptoms continued. She had already gained 8 pounds. What on earth is this? Allison whispered, clutching the diagnosis. Something medically impossible was happening. Her husband pretended indifference, her mother-in-law was strangely confident. And something was definitely happening to her body. Allison began looking up the phone number for an obstetrics and gynecology clinic with trembling hands. She could no longer bear this confusion alone. Tuesday morning, Allison went alone to St. Mary's General Hospital. In the obstetrics waiting room, happy pregnant women sat with their husbands or mothers. Only Allison was alone. When she gave her name at reception, the nurse greeted her with a warm smile. "Mrs. McGregor, congratulations. Is this your first visit?" "Yes," Allison's voice trembled. "But I have some complicated circumstances." "That's all right. Dr. Parsons is a very experienced doctor. Please feel free to discuss anything with him." After waiting about 30 minutes in the waiting room, Allison's name was called. When she entered the examination room, a male doctor in his late 50s stood up to greet her. Dr. James Parsons was a well-regarded obstetrician in the area. "Mrs. McGregor, nice to meet you. You're here about a possible pregnancy." "Yes, but," Allison hesitated. "Actually, I was diagnosed with infertility 5 years ago." Dr. Parsons frowned. "At which hospital?" "Here. I was treated by Dr. Miller." "Dr. Miller? My predecessor. What was the diagnosis?" "Bilateral fallopian tube blockage making natural pregnancy impossible." The doctor's expression became serious. "Yet you're having pregnancy symptoms." "My belly is getting bigger day by day, and I have morning sickness. But medically it should be impossible. Let's do an ultrasound first. We need to confirm the truth." Allison lay down on the examination table. When the doctor placed the ultrasound probe on her abdomen, black and white images appeared on the monitor. At first, she couldn't tell what was showing, but she noticed the doctor's expression changed dramatically. "This is," Dr. Parsons's voice trembled. "Is there a problem?" The doctor stared at the monitor and remained silent for a while. "Mrs. McGregor, you are indeed pregnant. It appears to be about 14 weeks." Allison's heart pounded violently. "Really? But how?" "That's the problem," the doctor showed a confused expression. "I've reviewed your past medical records, and Dr. Miller's diagnosis was accurate. With both fallopian tubes completely blocked, natural pregnancy is medically impossible." "Then what is this?" The doctor sat back in his chair and chose his words carefully. "To be honest, current medicine cannot explain this. However, there is one possibility." "What kind?" "Artificial intervention. Using medical technology like in vitro fertilization or artificial insemination, pregnancy would be possible." Allison was confused. "But I haven't undergone any such procedures." "That is the most serious problem," the doctor's expression became even more grave. "We have no records of performing such procedures on you. We've also inquired with other medical facilities, and the result was the same." "That means?" "Medical procedures may have been performed without your consent," the doctor continued quietly. "This violates medical ethics and is also a serious legal matter." Allison's head began to spin. Is such a thing possible? Unfortunately, yes. Especially if the victim was unconscious, the doctor asked carefully. Have you had periods of unusual sleepiness or vague memory recently? Allison desperately searched her memory. 3 months ago, her voice trembled. Around that time, I was abnormally sleepy every day and had difficulty getting up in the morning. I thought it was a cold. How was your husband during that period? Chris was, Allison thought hard. He said work was busy and came home late often. But when I was bedridden, he made tea and soup for me. The doctor's expression became even more serious. Is your husband in the medical field? No, he's an accountant. But lately he's been doing a lot of research on his computer. Mrs. McGregor, the doctor sighed deeply. This is a very serious situation. There's a high possibility that artificial insemination was performed without your consent. That's impossible, Allison leaned back in her chair. Medical equipment can unfortunately be purchased online. Sperm donors can also be found online these days. Why would someone do such a thing to me? The doctor chose his words carefully. I don't know. However, I strongly recommend you consult with the police about this matter. The police? This could be a crime beyond medical practice. It might constitute assault, or even more serious felonies. Allison felt as though the world was spinning. Her husband's recent cold attitude, her mother-in-law's meaningful smile, and the inexplicable changes happening to her body. Everything began connecting like a nightmare. Mrs. McGregor. The doctor's voice sounded distant. Allison tried to stand up, but her legs had no strength. Are you all right? Chris, she said in a trembling voice. He did this to me. Suddenly, the examination room turned completely white. Allison collapsed from her chair and lost consciousness. A nurse rushed in and carried Allison to a bed in another room. 30 minutes later, she woke up. The doctor was watching over her with concern. How do you feel? Yes, Allison's voice was small. Doctor, what about the baby? The baby is fine. Don't worry. Allison sighed with relief. But reality immediately returned. I have to go to the police. That's right. However, there's one thing I'd like to confirm, the doctor continued carefully. We can do a DNA test to identify the biological father. That could serve as evidence. Yes, Allison steeled her resolve. I want to reveal everything. The doctor collected blood for testing. The results will be available in a week. However, please consult with the police before waiting for that. When leaving the hospital, Allison's determination had become unshakable. Sitting in her car in the parking lot, she took out her cell phone with trembling hands. She looked up the police station's number and made the call. Boston Police Department. I want to report a crime. Allison's voice was quiet but filled with strong will. I was subjected to medical procedures without my consent. I understand. Can you come to the station right away? Yes. I'm coming now. When Allison pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Boston police station, her legs were shaking. The officer at reception saw her pale face and immediately guided her to a private room. Detective Sarah O'Connor was an investigator specializing in sex crimes. Her kind gaze and calm manner somewhat eased Allison's tension. Mrs. McGregor, you've been through a terrible experience. Please take your time and tell me everything in detail. Allison explained the hospital's diagnosis results and the doctor's opinion in detail. Detective O'Connor took careful notes while occasionally asking questions. Tell me more about the unusual sleepiness 3 months ago. Every night after dinner, I became abnormally sleepy and didn't wake up once until morning. I used to be a light sleeper, but during that period I fell into deep sleep. How was your husband during that time? He was kinder than usual. Allison showed a bitter smile. He made tea and soup for me. But now that I think about it, I became especially sleepy after drinking that tea. Detective O'Connor's expression hardened. Would it be possible to examine your husband's smartphone and computer? We can get a warrant from family court. However, we need sufficient evidence. That night, Allison stayed at her friend Dorothy's house. She could no longer sleep under the same roof as her husband. The next morning, Detective O'Connor contacted her. The judge issued a warrant. We're going to search your home now. Could you be present? At 10 in the morning, police officers arrived at the McGregor house. Chris was at the accounting office but hurried home after receiving an emergency call. His face was pale and he was clearly agitated. What's this commotion? Chris glared at Allison. Did you call the police? I just want to know the truth, Allison answered resolutely. The investigators began searching the entire house. Chris's smartphone and computer were confiscated. Also, what appeared to be medical equipment was discovered in the back of the bedroom closet. When Detective O'Connor examined Chris's smartphone, decisive evidence was immediately found. What is this? The detective showed the smartphone screen. The screen displayed a massive message history. The contact's name was Jessica. When Allison saw the content, she nearly collapsed on the spot. I want to divorce quickly and be together, don't worry about Allison, but I don't want to pay alimony. Even more shocking content followed. If we make it look like Allison had an affair, we could get alimony instead, it's a perfect plan. No one will suspect, your mother said she'd cooperate, right? Chris's face turned completely pale. This is. Let me continue reading, Detective O'Connor continued calmly. Found a sperm donor on SNS. Will execute tomorrow. Mom prepared the sleeping pills. If Allison gets pregnant with another man's child, it will be decisive evidence of adultery. Allison stood up trembling. You did this to frame me as an adulteress. No. This isn't. Chris tried to make excuses frantically, but the evidence was clear. At that moment, the front door opened. Margaret entered carrying shopping bags. Seeing the police officers, her face also turned pale. What's happening? When Detective O'Connor showed her the smartphone screen, Margaret sat down. The words, Mom prepared the sleeping pills caught her eye. Margaret McGregor, you're also under arrest. The next day, the local newspaper reported this incident with large headlines. The article caused a huge shock to the local community. In the interrogation room, Chris confessed as if he had given up. I'd been seeing Jessica for 2 years. I wanted to marry her, but divorce would cost me half my assets. When I consulted a lawyer, he told me I could claim alimony if Allison committed adultery. So you tried to make your wife have an affair with another man. That was the original plan. But Allison was too honest and wouldn't take the bait. So I thought of another method. The method of making her pregnant with another man's sperm. Finding a sperm donor on SNS was easy. Medical equipment could also be purchased online. Since my mother had been a nurse, she taught me the procedure. Margaret was also being interrogated in another room. I did it for my son's happiness, she testified through tears. Allison is a good daughter-in-law, but she can't have children. Jessica is younger and would surely be a better mother. So you prepared the sleeping pills. I used connections from when I worked at the hospital. I just wanted to make my son happy. In court, the prosecutor presented evidence piece by piece. 2 years of message history with Jessica, detailed plans to gain advantage in divorce proceedings, communications with sperm donors on SNS, and the purchased medical equipment. Everything revealed it was a meticulously planned crime. The defendant committed an unprecedented crime of forcibly impregnating his wife with another man's sperm in order to frame her, the prosecutor stated forcefully. This is not mere adultery. This is a planned and malicious assault. Allison testified on the witness stand through tears. I just wanted to be loved by my husband and build a normal family. Instead, He framed me as an adulteress and even used the child in my womb to try to get alimony. It's unforgivable as a human being. Many spectators packed the courtroom. Local women voiced sympathy for Allison. At the same time, voices of anger toward Chris and Margaret also arose. The defense sought leniency, but the judge made a harsh decision. This crime is planned and extremely malicious. It completely ignores the victim's human rights and has enormous impact on society. The verdict was handed down. Chris received 7 years in prison for assault and attempted fraud. Margaret received 3 years suspended sentence with 5 years probation for conspiracy. In the courtroom, small applause arose from Allison's supporters. At the press conference after the verdict, Allison spoke with a resolute expression. "I'm glad the truth came to light. This child is innocent. Regardless of whose DNA it is, I will take responsibility as a mother and raise the child." Chris's mistress Jessica disappeared when she learned of his arrest. It was later discovered that she had married another man. Chris realized in prison that he had lost everything. Allison took the first step toward a new life. Together with the child in her womb, she began walking toward a future built on truth. 1 year after the verdict, Allison was working at a library in a small Vermont town, holding her newborn daughter Emma. In the season of fresh greenery, soft sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated the peaceful expressions of mother and child. Chris was serving his sentence in state prison. He had never come to visit even once. His former mistress Jessica had married another man immediately after the incident came to light and was now reportedly living a new life in another state. Would the day come when Chris would understand the magnitude of what he had lost? Margaret was living lonely days in a nursing home while on probation. Her son, and the new daughter-in-law she had hoped for, had both left her. According to the nurses, she sat by the window every day, continuing to wait for someone to visit. However, no one ever came. Allison held her daughter on her lap and read her a fairy tale in a gentle voice. Once upon a time, a beautiful princess lived in a deep forest. Emma reached out her small hand, trying to touch the pages of the picture book. Watching this gesture, Allison smiled quietly. The DNA test results were stored in the back of a drawer. Unopened. She felt no need to open them. Emma was undoubtedly her daughter. The library colleagues warmly welcomed Allison and Emma. Especially the head librarian, Mrs. Thompson, willingly took care of Emma while she was at the library. "Watching you two makes me think about what a real family is," Mrs. Thompson said. "It's not blood relations, but love." On weekend afternoons, Allison would take Emma in her stroller for walks in the nearby park. Sitting on a bench feeding Emma baby food, she noticed a letter. The sender was Chris. When she opened it, it contained words of apology and regret. "I know that nothing I say now can be forgiven. But I hope you and Emma will be happy." After reading the letter, Allison quietly tore it up. Emma reached out her small hand, showing interest in the scattered paper fragments. "Emma, you were wanted," Allison spoke to her daughter while gently touching her cheek. The method was just wrong. In the park pond, a family of ducks swam contentedly. Small ducklings desperately followed their mother duck. Watching this scene, Allison sighed deeply. In the evening, after putting Emma to bed, Allison opened her diary. It was a habit she continued every night. Today marks 10 months since Emma was born. Looking at her smile, all the painful things from the past seemed to have had meaning. Family isn't about blood relations or legal relationships. Only when we have hearts that care for and respect each other can we become a true family. Emma and I are accumulating small happinesses today too. Outside the window, the full moon shone quietly. Its light gently illuminated the sleeping faces of Allison and Emma. Deep silence filled the room, with only the regular breathing of mother and child audible. Allison's new life was certainly a difficult path. However, days built on truth were far more valuable than a past filled with lies. And above all, the small life named Emma gave her meaning and hope to live. Tomorrow again, she would share the wonder of books with many people at the library and continue growing together with Emma. That was the most precious happiness for Allison now. The peaceful sleeping faces of mother and child bathed in moonlight quietly told the story of hope for a new life.